All right, I invite you to open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. And I'm happy to announce that after 3 weeks of preparation, we actually are finally moving into 1 Corinthians chapter 7. The subject of 1 Corinthians 7, of course, is that of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And in order to prepare ourselves for what Paul teaches here in this passage, we have been trying to look at some of what the rest of the Bible has to say about this subject. And after 3 weeks of putting material together from the Old Testament, from the teachings of Jesus, we are now ready to draw some conclusions and then come into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul is going to give his own contribution to this subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So we've learned a number of things here in what we've looked at over the last 3 weeks. Number one, we learned that there are at least 4 purposes of marriage that we can discern from Scripture. 3 of those we learn in the creation story itself, and those 3 reasons are companionship, partnership, and reproduction. Okay? The family is the base unit of all human society. It's what God started with. However, when you come to the New Testament, Paul's going to add a 4th purpose to marriage that he said is a mystery. And in biblical language, that means it was something that was hidden throughout the Old Testament period, but that has now been made known, and indeed, he's the one that makes it known. And that 4th purpose of marriage is that marriage is a picture and a preview of Christ's marriage to the church. And indeed, that is one of the ultimate purposes of marriage. It's one of the reasons why marriage is to be permanent, because it is supposed to be a picture of that union that is eventually going to happen between God and us in the new creation. So having learned the purposes of marriage in the first week, we then, for the next couple of weeks, turned our attention towards the subject of divorce and remarriage. We learned that there are no laws in the Old Testament in regard to divorce. This is because marriage is assumed to be permanent. We did learn that if adultery took place in a marriage, that person could be forgiven or they were stoned to death. Okay, and so the innocent party was allowed to remarry in that particular case because their spouse had died. Now, in later times, Israel no longer had the right to carry out capital punishment when they were under the Romans and the Persians and different kind of governments over time. And so, eventually, an exception clause developed so that people would not have to be trapped into adulterous marriages. And Jesus confirms in his teaching that indeed that exception is a legitimate exception. Having said all that, even though God intends marriage to be permanent and intends marriage to be a lifelong thing, it is also true we live in a sinful world, difficult things happen, and God has historically made concessions on this subject because of the reality of life. And Jesus acknowledges that God, through Moses, made some concessions. And I've argued last week that it is reasonable to believe, I think, that he still does make concessions in this regard. Jesus, when you just read the Sermon on the Mount or some of his other teaching, he uses very shocking language, which he often does in the Sermon on the Mount. In the same way that it's shocking for him to say, if you struggle with lust, you need to cut out your eye or cut off your arm. So he's saying if you divorce for any other reason than marital infidelity, you are causing your spouse to be guilty of adultery, and you yourself will be guilty of adultery if you remarry or if someone marries a divorced person. And I think what Jesus is doing there is he's trying, number one, to take them back to the Creator's intention, but number two, he is trying to shock the Pharisees who have a very permissive view about marriage and divorce. And he's trying to say to them, the practical result of your view is you've got adultery going on everywhere because nobody is fulfilling their vows. Okay? So with that basic review in mind, we're now ready to move into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which is Paul's contribution to this particular subject. But I want you to know, Paul does not bring this up at random. He is addressing this because the congregation has questions about this particular subject. Now, if you were here, 3 or 4 weeks ago when we had our first session for the fall, I noted that 1 Corinthians splits up pretty naturally into 2 different parts. Chapters 1 through 6 has to do with issues that are raised by members of Chloe's household who are concerned about some of the things that are going on. But then beginning in chapter 7 and going all the way through the end of at least chapter 11 and maybe farther, Paul is now addressing questions that they have written to him about that they need some clarification on, okay? Paul had written an original letter to the Corinthians, which we don't have. And if we did have it, that would be the true 1 Corinthians, and what we now know as 1 Corinthians would be 2 Corinthians. But even though we do not have that initial letter, we can discern some things about what he wrote in that letter based on questions they ask in need of clarification. And one of those questions is about marriage. And in particular, as we start chapter 7 here, we're going to see that one of those questions is about the nature of sex in and of itself. So if your Bible's open there to chapter 7 and verse 1, or if you want to look at your handout, it's on the back side of your handout. Here's how Paul begins chapter 7. He says, "Now for the matters that you wrote about," and he says, "it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." Now, 2 things you want to notice here. Notice he says, "Now for the matters you wrote about." So here's the place where he's making the transition in the letter to talk about the things that they have written to him about. But the second is this line. Paul says, "It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman." And in my NIV Bible, which is the 2011 update edition, it puts this particular line in quotes. Anybody else's Bible have that in quotes? If you have the older NIV, I'm not sure that it does, but if you have the English Standard Version in the more recent updates, it also puts it in quotes. Why is it in quotes? Well, it's because many scholars believe, and I agree with them, that Paul is quoting a line from his previous letter, and it's this particular line that they have a question about. If it is good for people to abstain from sexual relationships, does that mean there is something not good or even evil about sex itself? And before you just dismiss that question out of hand, let me tell you that this is a question that Christian history has long wrestled with. Now, I don't think it is quite such an issue in our day, but it has been traditionally a very big issue in the past. As a matter of fact, if we were to travel back to the Middle Ages, there was a great elevation in the Middle Ages of the status of virginity. And even in marriage, except for in the occasions when sex was engaged in for the purpose of having children, there were many people who thought that sex for any other reason was somehow tainted with evil. I have a book on my shelf at home that I actually brought with me here this morning that is written by a Catholic man. This was written in 2006, I believe. It's written by a Catholic novelist named Piers Paul Reed. Anybody heard of Piers Paul Reed before? Anyways, he writes this particular book, and he's writing it's just a series of essays, and it's called Hell and Other Destinations. And he talks about in an essay that's an exciting title, isn't it? Yeah, Hell and Other Destinations. Yeah, he writes about this book that he believes sex outside of for the purpose of procreation is wrong, even in marriage, and he talks about in one of these essays how he has struggled in his marriage because he has had a hard time living up to that, and indeed has fallen at it many times, and he deals with a lot of guilt because of his relationship in his marriage. Now that's written by a Catholic in 2006. That's not all that long ago, okay? So it just goes to show you that kind of thought is still out there. So as we start Paul's examination of this subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, this is where we're going to begin. We begin with the question of whether or not sex is a good thing, or is it an evil thing, only to be tolerated in the case of having children. And I suspect you already know the answer to this question. I have no doubt you have your opinion about this particular question, but we want to see how Paul works it out in our text here today. So with that in mind, let's pause and read our passage for consideration. If your own Bible's there, I'll invite you to look at chapter 7 and verse 1. Chapter 7 and verse 1. Let's read the first 7 verses together. This is kind of a thought unit here. Now for the matters that you wrote about. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But, and that's a big but there, I just walked right into that one, didn't I? You know what I mean. Yeah, what do I mean? Yeah, that's right. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then, come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not as a command, but I wish that all of you were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift and another that. So as we examine this passage here today, I have brought back my powers of alliteration here. I like to do that every once in a while in these lessons. And so we're going to break down our passage under 4 different headings, and those 4 different headings are going to be categorized by a word that begins with the letter C. Okay? And so if you have your handout and you want to look at it, you'll notice the 4 Roman numerals there where they are listed. In verses 1 and 2, there is a clarification. In verses 3 and 4, there is a command. In verse 5, there is a compromise. And then finally, in verses 6 and 7, a concession. So a clarification, a command, a compromise, and a concession. Let's start with the clarification. The clarification comes in verses 1 and 2, and as I was stating earlier, it appears that Paul is reflecting back on something that was written to them in their first letter, and now they have a question about it. So verse 1 opens by saying, now for the matters that you wrote about. And Paul is going to go on to say what he wrote about. And he does this quote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations for a woman. Okay? Why would Paul say that? As I was saying before, my NIV Bible has it in quotes, and so does the ESV Bible, and I think that's right. I think he's quoting back to something he had said last time. So why would he have said that in his previous letter? Well, first of all, let's just acknowledge that the Jews had a very robust view of sex and sexuality. They were not prudes, okay? As a matter of fact, they were much more open about it and celebrated it much more in their history than Christians have done in their history. Because as we said earlier, in the Middle Ages, there developed a real bias against sex, even in marriage, and that bias has never been a part of Jewish culture. Why not? Well, it goes back to what the Jews feel like is one of the first commands for humanity: be fruitful and multiply. Be one flesh together. And if God commanded those 2 things, then the Jews think that could not at one and the same time be a bad thing. And so with that in mind, I just want you to think about how the Jews actually have a whole book of the Bible that is dedicated simply to the expression of sexual love. What's that book called? Yeah, Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon. And it's interesting because Christianity developed this bias against sex, and they knew this book was in the Bible, so they had to reinterpret it. And so in the Middle Ages, they reinterpreted the Song of Songs as if it is an allegory about Christ and the church. Okay? Well, I'm not opposed to reading it in that way, but that's not, if you read it, clearly what the book is about. It's about a young couple who traces their relationship in the opening few chapters through the courtship time and their strong passion for one another. And then there is the scene where they eventually come together and they get married and they consummate the marriage, and it's this beautiful thing. And then in the last half of the book, they even talks about their first fight together. He shows up one night and he's been out working, and he shows up and he's full of passion and he's ready to meet his wife. And his wife says, I'm already in bed. I've already got my sandals off. I've got my hair up. And she kind of turns him down. And he gets really upset about this. You know how it is when you're first married. Any kind of denial is just heartbreaking. And so he goes running off to the city, and she gets worried about him and goes looking for him and finally brings him back to their home again. Okay? That's the Song of Songs. So it has to be acknowledged that the Jews have a very robust appreciation for sexual love. And Paul, he's part of that culture. He's a part of that. So why then would Paul say it is good for a man not to have sex with a woman? Well, he will clarify it later in the chapter. Paul knows marriage is going to be the normal course for most people. Paul knows that most people will struggle to control their sexual desires if they do not have marriage as a legitimate outlet for that. But he also knows those who are married have divided attention. Because on the one hand, they love the Lord and they want to serve him, but on the other hand, they have the very practical reality of needing to attend to their spouse and their children and all of the struggles that come with family life. And anybody who's been a part of family life knows it can be a struggle sometimes, even though it's wonderful and a blessed thing. Look down at verse 32, either on your handout or in your own Bible. He says, I would like you to be free from concern. An unmarried man, like myself, that's what he's kind of implying, an unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord. But a married man is concerned about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife. And his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit, but a married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. So here, ultimately, I think Paul is explaining why he would say it is good for people to abstain from marriage and sexual activity. It is because the unmarried can give themselves fully to the work of the Lord, whereas the married person has their attention divided just by the necessity of things. And that's it, really. That's his only explanation for that. It's not because sex is evil. It's not because marriage is bad in any way. Quite the contrary. According to the Jews, marriage and sex is going to be the normal way for most people, but there is something kind of special about those who have the gift to give themselves fully to the Lord. And we'll talk a little bit more about that gift a little bit later. Now, as we acknowledge this, it is important for us to also acknowledge what Paul said here has really been twisted in Christian history. And there are several things that have contributed to this. Number one, when the church began, in the early years of the church, there was a very strong emphasis on ascetic practices that developed early on in Christianity. And so, in their zeal early on, they often demanded things of people that were not really necessary. Severe forms of fasting, special spiritual disciplines. So some people, they wouldn't allow them to serve in the army and other things like that. And of course, they had this practice of exalting virginity and celibacy. All of that was really made concrete with the teaching of Augustine. Okay? Augustine was a very influential church father, one of the smartest Christians probably that's ever lived, and he lived from about 350 AD to about 430, right around the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. Augustine has a wild story. He has a very religious Christian mother. Her name's Monica. You've heard of Saint Monica. That's in Saint Monica's Pier, and Saint Monica all over. That's who it comes from. This is the original Saint Monica. And she was very concerned about her son because Augustine really rebelled in his younger years. He was wickedly smart, he loved philosophy, and he also had a very strong sexual appetite. So he became a philosopher and a teacher, and he took on a concubine, and he lived with this concubine for quite a number of years. It was not until he converted to the Christian faith that he realized that he had to put her away. Why he didn't just marry her, I don't know, but she was a lower social status than him, and so you don't take on concubines that are of your same status. You marry someone who's your same status in that world, and Augustine was not willing to do that, so he put her away, and he never really got over that. It was a struggle for him for the rest of his life. Well, last week in our sermon, and we mentioned it again today, we talked a little bit about how Adam's sin, brought death and condemnation to all of us. You remember that? And Augustine is famous for developing the first great theory about this, and it's called original sin. You all have heard original sin before? Well, here's how it's relevant to this discussion. Augustine not only believed that condemnation was passed down to us and death, but he also believed a sinful nature was passed on to us. That sinful nature is passed on through the sexual act, and because that's true, he says even sex in marriage is tainted with sin. And he believed that there could be lust that happened in marriage, and that sex was permissible for the reason of trying to have children, but beyond that, husbands and wives should abstain from one another because they are participating in an activity that has been tainted. Okay? Now, that view would be very unpopular today, but I'm telling you, that view took hold, and it was dominant in Christian history all through the Middle Ages. Okay? And so to this very day, as I've demonstrated for you, in Catholic circles, they often look with suspicion about sexual activity, even in marriage, unless it is tied to procreation, which is one of the reasons they're against birth control and any of that kind of stuff. Well, it's a real shame that that particular idea developed because people used 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 1 as evidence for backing up what they thought Paul meant about this. And that's not what Paul's saying. He's saying that it is good for a man to abstain from sexual relations with a woman or vice versa, so that, if they choose, they can give themselves wholly to the Lord. They can be fully devoted to the Lord. Because you have to follow it up, verse 1, with verse 2. What does it say? But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. So Paul actually is just real practical here. It would be great, he thought, if more people could refrain from marriage and give themselves wholly to the work of the Lord. But in the real world, where the battle of our sexual appetite is real and powerful, each man should have his own wife, each wife should have her own husband, and they should freely share in the sexual relationship together. Because not only does it work to unite them into that one flesh union that we've talked so much about, but Paul says it also protects from immorality. It protects you from temptation, and Paul thinks that is a very important thing. So that's the clarification. The clarification is celibacy is a good thing, but for many reasons, least of which is the immorality in the world. Each man should have his own wife, each wife her own husband, and they should share in intimacy together. From the clarification, Paul is now going to move on to the command, Roman numeral number 2 there on your handout, verses 3 and 4. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband. And in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his body, but yields it to his wife. So here's the command. For those of you who do have a spouse, fulfill your marital duty of intimacy with them. Do not withhold yourself from your spouse. Now, I don't know whether you appreciate this or not, but we have here in these 2 verses something that's really kind of extraordinary in the Roman world. Paul says something here that would have sounded very foreign, I think, to Roman ears. A husband and a wife have a duty to one another, and their bodies belong to one another, and they have a right to one another. They're obligated to each other. Now, in the Roman world, it might not have been unheard of to hear a man say that his wife's body belonged to him, but to say that his body belonged to her as well, that would have been quite a unique thing to hear at that particular time. Let's note a couple of things about this. Paul is confirming the goodness of sexual intimacy in marriage. Contrary to those who would later try to claim that it was only for childbearing and nothing else, Paul is speaking directly against this impulse here. Not only does he say nothing in regard to childbearing in the sexual relationship, but he speaks as if sexual intimacy is a right. That's the way that it is in one translation, or a duty, depending upon your other translation, of each spouse to the other. Why is that the case? A couple reasons. Number one, the sexual union is meant to be a way of binding a husband and wife together into that one flesh union that goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. But second, having regular intimacy in your marriage is part of what protects your spouse from immorality. And if they are denied what Paul says is their right, you put your spouse in a very awkward situation because they do not have then a legitimate outlet for their passions. But here's one other thing to note, which I've already alluded to. There's a mutual obligation here that would have been, I think, unique in the Roman world. It's not just the husband's desire that matter, but so also the wife's desires matter. The husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but a wife has authority over his body. And not only does a wife have authority over her own body, but the husband does as well. There is a mutuality here that I think, before this particular time, would have been kind of an unknown thing. And it gives, I think, an incredible status to women in the ancient world in this particular thing. Now, I want to point to one other element that would have been a factor in all of this. One reason some people may have been abstaining from sexual relations in Corinth is because I would imagine some of the people who had converted into the church there and had been baptized probably were married to unbelievers. Don't you imagine that was probably the case? And so, if you have this emphasis in Scripture, and you do, that the pure is not to be tainted by the impure, you may have had some Christians there in Corinth who were married to unbelievers who thought they should not be sharing in the sexual relationship with their unbelieving spouse. Okay? And the reason we think that might be an issue is what Paul is going to go on to say a little bit later in the chapter. In verses 12 through 16, Paul is going to explicitly address those who are married to unbelievers. And he's going to teach people to stay in that marriage. Don't divorce the unbelieving spouse unless the unbelieving spouse wants out because you're a Christian. And if they want out, then God says we live, Paul says we want to live at peace, and so we're going to let them go. But otherwise, the Christian is not bound in that particular situation. So it's not hard to connect the dots to think that for some in Corinth, they might have thought that being married to their unbelieving spouse, that they might deny their spousal right to them. And Paul says, no, you shouldn't do that. A husband has a duty to the wife. A wife has a duty to the husband. That doesn't change if there's an unbeliever in the situation. You're not to deny one another. You need that one flesh intimacy, and you need that protection from sexual sin. Okay? All right, that's going to lead to our third word for this morning, a compromise. We've seen a clarification about celibacy, a command about mutual rights in intimacy and marriage. Now Paul envisions a place where a compromise might take place, where sexual intimacy actually is given up for a short period of time, but under mutual agreement. Why? He says in verse 5, do not deprive each other except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Then come together again so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So the general principle still stands, but there is a compromise made for certain kind of situations. Don't deprive each other, except perhaps for a time, when you want to give yourselves mutually to special prayer. Now the question is, why would you need to stop your sex life in order to pray? Most of the time my sex life doesn't get in the way of prayer, so why would this be a factor? And here I think he's talking about sex in a similar way that he would talk about food. In the normal course of things, food doesn't get in the way of your prayer, right? I mean, it doesn't keep me from praying. I don't know if it does any of you. But we also know there are those special occasions where fasting is called for. Now, why would that be the case? Well, first of all, there are those occasions which are so severe that you lose your appetite. You ever had that happen? Have you ever had a situation in your family where you're among your loved ones and something has happened that is serious and put them in danger, or maybe there's been a death and you just lose your appetite? I remember this 4th of July, we were out at the house, and it was just getting dusk, and we were getting ready to shoot off our fireworks for the evening, and we're ready for a festive time, and before it got dark, Andrew and Luke were shooting off these, well, we call them zingers. I don't know what their official word is, but they're things that you light and then you throw them, and while they're up in the air, they zoom, and and they flare out and take off. Well, they were doing those, and one of them, I don't know if it's because he held it too long or just because it malfunctioned. I think it just malfunctioned. But he lit that in a hand and it went off right in his hand, in Luke's hand. And he starts jumping around, oh, and I said, oh, what happened? He's like, it went off in my hand, so come here and let me look at it. And he brings his finger to me and he shows it to me, and he has burnt a hole about 3 layers deep in the top of his finger, and it's just black all the way around it. And of course, I just had a sudden sick feeling in my stomach as I was seeing that. And I was like, oh my goodness, son. And so for a little bit, we're like, what are we going to do? We had planned, we had spent how much between you and me and Tanner, and we spent like $900 in fireworks. This was I didn't spend that much. They spent a lot of it, but we spent a lot of money on fireworks, and we were like, but we were kind of out of the mood all of a sudden. We didn't want to carry on with it, because we decided we probably need to take him to the emergency room, and we did, and so on and so forth. Well, that turned out to be a fairly minor thing. Luckily, it was a 3rd-degree burn, that they were able to treat it, and no permanent damage other than his fingerprint's going to be a little messed up for the rest of his life. But turned out to be not to such a thing. But I've been in situations similar to that where it was much more serious. You probably have too. And sometimes when you're in a situation like that, people actually have to remind you to eat. You ever been in that kind of pain? So when something like that happens, that is a natural time to fast. And the Bible often talks about fasting in that context when something really serious, like the story of Esther, for example, when something really serious has happened and it just kind of takes it out of you anyways, and so you fast as a way of increasing the intensity of your petition. Same thing could be true in regard to our sexual desire. When something really serious happens in our life, or whenever someone that you love is in trouble, or they're suffering, or there's been a death, oftentimes it will kill that natural desire in you, and for a time, you and your spouse may want to simply give yourselves to prayer, you see. Now, it is true, ironically enough, sometimes in heightened, stressful situations, it can actually increase your sexual desire. One of my spiritual counselors back in Texas used to talk about this. He would say, when you're in a heightened, stressful situation, not sinful, the body has extra energy, and the body wants to release that some way. And sometimes it's very natural for that to just travel to your loins, okay, because it's looking for release. And so it's not unheard of for spouses to be really drawn to one another during times of great pressure. And I've talked to people who felt guilty about that, and I usually want to say to them, don't feel guilty. That's part of your leaning on one another during that particular time, and it is actually kind of natural, so that can happen in those two ways. But there is a second aspect to this temporary celibacy. Just as you don't necessarily need to fast from food in order to, you don't need to be distressed in order to fast from food. You don't have to be distressed to fast from sexual intimacy either. Sometimes you just want to channel your thoughts. You want to kind of harness the physical energy of your body. And so, in order to do that for a short period of time, you and your spouse agree we're going to refrain from sexual activity in order that we can specially give ourselves to prayer for this dedicated period of time. There's a great biblical example of this. I think I put it on the back of your handout. Exodus chapter 19. You have the story of Israel coming to Mount Sinai. God is getting ready to make a covenant with them, and He wants them to be specially ready for that. And it's a serious moment. God's going to come down on the mountain. He's going to come down on top of Mount Sinai in fire and storm and this big cloud. And he tells the Israelites, I want you to draw a line around the base of the mountain, and nobody gets close to that mountain. Nobody crosses over that line, not a human being, not even an animal, or they're going to be struck dead. Okay, a very serious moment. God's going to make this covenant with them, and he tells them before he does that, I want you to wash your clothes. I want you to put on your Sunday best, for lack of better terms. And for 3 days, I want you to abstain from sexual activity. Okay? Why? Because there was something serious going on here, and he wanted their focus and their attention. And the same principle could be true in our prayer life. There might be some special event that's coming up. There might be some special concern in your heart. There may be some battle that you're especially fighting. And you may want to give yourself especially to prayer for a few days. And Paul says you can do that. You can make the mutual agreement to give yourself to prayer during that time, but then come back together so that Satan doesn't come between you and give you a source of temptation. Last one, as we finish up, I'm going to rip up my notes here in a minute, but the last one is a concession, okay? And so look at verse 6. We'll see the concession here. I say this as a concession to you, not as a command. I wish that you all were as I am. But each of you has your own gift from God. One has this and another has that. Well, why does Paul say this is a concession? He says it's a concession because he wishes everybody was like him. I don't need marriage, he says. I can give myself fully to the Lord, and it is a wonderful, wonderful thing. And Paul wishes everybody was like him. Although that really wouldn't work, or we wouldn't have any children to take care of us anymore, right? So that wouldn't work very well. But you see what Paul's saying, okay? But he says, as a concession, I realize you're not like me. Everybody has their own gift. And he says celibacy is a gift that some people have from the Lord. And for those who have it, it's great. Use it. Give your life and dedication to the Lord. But the majority will not have it. And so, as a concession, he says to them, yes, marry, participate in intimacy, enjoy that life together, and that is something that is a good and blessed thing. So that is how Paul begins his discussion on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Next week, as we pick up things in verse 8, he is going to get more specifically into the different pieces of advice that he has for people in different categories when it comes to divorce and remarriage. And that's where all of our background information is going to really come in and help us. But today, he's just talking about that base element, that idea of the sexual union between a man and a woman, and he's clarifying for them. I didn't mean to say that it's an evil thing, but it is a good thing for some if they can give themselves wholly to the Lord. For the rest, give yourselves to each other. That's an important principle.